On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome and thank everyone for coming and participating in this, what I think is an incredibly important and timely conference on one of the most important sociological and societal problems of our time. I'd also like to thank and echo Dean Miller's thank you to Andy Littlefair and Clean Energy for sponsoring this and giving us the ability to bring together this community from across the campus to tackle this topic. Thank you.
Bob Inglis is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina who I admire very, very much because he actually took some chances to stand up on this issue. And he's a very special person, and I'm going to start with him. Talk to us about the primary challenge you faced in South Carolina. In some sense, weren't you punished for the courage you showed on the climate issue? Can GOP candidates make the case on climate and still win primaries?
The unpleasantness of late, huh? That was, oh, take me back. Do you have to, Bob, to 2010? It was pretty rough, I got to tell you. A cautionary tale. Basically, note to self, if you represent the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation, probably don't want to introduce a carbon tax in the midst of the Great Recession. It will not go well for you. And after 12 years in Congress, the other guy got 71% of the vote in a Republican runoff, and I got the other 29%. So rather spectacular faceplant, and ever since been out to convince fellow conservatives that it's no heresy, that it's actually completely consistent with conservative orthodoxy to say, act on climate change.
You making any progress with him?
Well, Bob, it's interesting. It's been a slog, you know, since I started this basically in 2011 on this path. You know, essentially a foundation came to me and said, you know, unusual zoo animal you are, Inglis, you know, actual conservative who says climate change is real. You're speaking right for the proposition. And so I said, well, if the cage is nice and the food is good, well, the cage is very nice to be at a place like USC, and I think the food might be good too. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. But the early days is hard, but here lately things are starting to pop, and it's really pretty exciting to see Republicans coming around from various causes, sometimes convenience, sometimes conviction. We'll take it either way. But things are beginning to move.
Lisa, do you see signs that there's a kind of bipartisan, at least the beginnings of bipartisan concern about this?
I mean, it ebbs and flows, and I think, you know, one of the things that Bob and I were talking, I assume at some point this is going to get around to the Green New Deal, so let's start with the Green New Deal. One of the things Bob and I were talking about, you know, ahead of Secretary Kerry's speech was whether the Green New Deal had an effect, had helped open up a space for, you know, perhaps incongruously for more Republican discussion of climate change. You know, one can debate what it is that is prompting it right now. It could be that Democrats, more broadly, now that Democrats have the House, are really going gangbusters on climate change and forcing a discussion on the issue, and also catapulted by the energy around the Green New Deal and the discussion that has provoked. But I think you're seeing on a whole number of levels. I mean, you had, I don't know if anyone watched the debate in the Senate last week over the Green New Deal and this vote that Senator McConnell called on it, but at one point you had Senator McConnell under questioning from Senator Shrum acknowledging that climate change is real and is caused by human activity. You had Senator Barrasso from Wyoming make the case that he has been talking about climate change for a long time. And that he, you know, and that he also has solutions. They might not be the ones that Democrats, you know, are embracing, but he wants to see more nuclear, more investment in CCS. You have Matt Gaetz in the House introducing his version of Green New Deal legislation. You have lawmakers like Congressman Walden and Shimkus, you know, conservatives in the House who've written letters now saying, look, we don't agree with the Green New Deal. This is not the way we want to go, but we think climate change is something that we can find bipartisan solutions on. It's not everywhere. It's not widespread. There's still a lot of you know, there's still a lot of climate denial in Congress as well, but you're definitely seeing, I'm definitely seeing activity where as recently as December, you know, right after the midterms, there were all these stories saying, you know, yeah, Democrats have the House, but we're not going to expect much on climate change this year. And here we are, and there's a lot.
Okay, well, I'm going to get it. By the way, anybody can jump in at any point on this panel that wants to. But Kevin, I want to get a Democratic perspective from you. You've been a leader in a very different state. What happened to Bob in South Carolina, it would be inconceivable here, at least in most congressional districts. Can we get voters, or can people get voters in other states to care about the environment in the way the Californians do?
Bob, I think we can. There's no question about it. I think it's happening today. A lot of folks forget that as blue as California is today, we did send 2 Republicans to the White House, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. We are the home of, obviously, Ed Rollins and Cap Weinberger and George Shultz and Ed Meese and a whole number of other Republicans, and until recently, U.S. Senator Pete Wilson, also a Republican. So this was, subjectively speaking, at worst, this was a Republican-dominated political system. You know, at best, it was a bipartisan system, and that has eroded completely, where California now is decisively a very blue state and becoming a much more progressive state. That being said, with regards to what is happening in Washington, D.C. in the debates with the Green New Deal and the parliamentary, this was a tactical maneuver on behalf of Senator Mitch McConnell to put Democrats up on the vote before the nation. They're having these internal debates, but I think what is happening right now throughout the country, subnationals are leading the way. California is the largest economy in the world to legally commit itself to 100% clean energy. That's decarbonizing the grid by the year 2045 by sending out very strong market signals to the private sector. You know, we're sending the right market signals to attract the capital that's critical for innovation and creativity, the technologies that will help us get to 100% clean energy. So California has set the pathway. Just last week, Governor Lujan from New Mexico just signed into law 100% clean energy for New Mexico. The states of Nevada, Illinois, Jay Inslee in the state of Washington, Maryland, Como in New York, Massachusetts. These are all states that have introduced 100% clean energy measures. And just recently, we have a red state. The state of Idaho have introduced a bill, 100% clean energy, and the state, I should say the city of Boise, they have introduced 100% clean energy, and the latest one I found out was Montana. So the economics play out, because what I find quite interestingly, and I've always said, listen, if it takes putting, Old Glory, the red, white, and blue on top of a solar array panel, or on top of a wind turbine to make it patriotic, then so be it. But you can't defy the economics, because the price per kilowatt with renewable energy is less than natural gas is today. So if you're a consumer in a red state, and if you want to pay more out of your pocket for energy, I think it's the politicians at the local, state, and federal level whose responsibility is to set the tone, the pace, and the vision. And I think they, other than Bob, who I think is an exceptional example for South Carolina, they have failed, those politicians, including not just Republicans, but Democrats as well. A handful of Democrats have failed their constituencies, miserably, seeing the writing on the wall and where we're going with technology, what's happening with climate change. So I think that it is possible to be bipartisan. I've always said very clearly, as a progressive Democrat, climate change policies, renewable energy is not a democratic or progressive virtue. This is economics. It's about the environment, our own survivability. It's about economic growth, creating jobs that otherwise do not exist today. And the last tidbit I'd give you is that in California, and that's across the spectrum, whether it's energy efficiency, it's double pane windows, window fenestration, sensor lighting, insulation. We're not even getting into electrification of our transportation system, ZEBs, and renewable energy, sun, wind, and even geothermal. We've created 500,000 jobs in the clean energy space in California. That is 10 times more jobs in the clean energy space in California than there are coal mining jobs in all of America. So the economics are very clear, and you have a party and individuals who espouse the principles of the free market in competition who are clearly undermining and sabotaging competition and the value of free markets when it comes to renewable energy and clean energy. I think that folks on our side of the aisle, for whatever reasons, perhaps are not as adept at sometimes or astute politically to message or frame this in such a manner. If you recall, during the Barack Obama administration, we had the so-called scandal of Solyndra up in the East Bay. And Solyndra was just one company, among a whole slew of other companies that received, capital infusion of loans to start the companies with regards to renewable energy. But the Republicans, distorted this and made this out to be a corrupt, inefficient scandal on part of the Obama administration. And you had Democrats in Washington, D.C. that got very scared, very tepid at the wheel, and almost abandoned the program altogether, wouldn't fight for it, in other words. So I agree with you 100% with regards to the long-term subsidies of the fossil fuel industry to be who they are with their current business model.
So Lisa mentioned the Green New Deal, and I want to start down at the end and come all the way up here. Do you think that the coming of the Green New Deal and the prominence of its sponsors has helped this cause or set it back? Because it's pretty clear if you look at Majority Leader McConnell's tactics that he thinks he can use the Green New Deal to push back against the idea of doing something about climate change.
Yeah, Bob, I think it's a developing story, as I was telling Lisa earlier today. I think that I'm fresh off an experience of being on the Chris Hayes show with Congresswoman OcasioCortez in the Bronx, in her district. About 350 cheering people, many of which during the break were saying, "We love you." I'm thinking, gee, I wish they used to say that to me. Anyway, so, so I'd say this, that at first I thought that it would push us away, but now I'm sort of wondering whether it's analogous to the anti-war demonstrations in the Vietnam War context, whether that created dissonance that accelerated the end of the Vietnam War, our involvement in the Vietnam War. So it could be that the energy and enthusiasm creates some dissonance. It seems to be creating dissonance among Republicans. And I think that it's such a developing story that, yes, Senator McConnell got that vote. Democrats voted present, but I just wonder whether it's now moving again such that Matt gets, as Lisa just mentioned, a conservative, an answer, a rejoinder to the Green New Deal. And so there's clearly some tension that's being created by all that. And so that could help us. The thing that I hope, though, is that there's a quick maturation of the forming Tea Party of the left, which may learn more quickly than the Tea Party of the right. The Tea Party of the right, I think you got to agree, right, has accomplished next to nothing over the last 10 years. Next to nothing. And so, but that's, the chance we have here is, the risk we have is that a Tea Party of the left is forming, but I think that the left, being generally more disposed toward government and not disposed toward Grover Norquist's view that we can shrink it down to the size that we could drown it in a bathtub, government that is, that on the right you'll have slower learning to figure out that this isn't working for us. But on the left, I think I saw it in the Congresswoman in the Bronx in her district, some sort of awareness that, wait, maybe we've got to come to Solutionville more quickly than staying out there on the extreme left. Because you stay on the extreme left, they'll accomplish about as much as the extreme right accomplished over the last decade on climate. A solution is available. John Kerry just described it in that carbon pricing mechanism. And that is something that can happen on the right and can be accepted on the right. And so just the question is whether the Tea Party of the left will learn quickly enough to say this isn't working for us.
Julien, you have a take on that?
Yeah, personally, does it work this time? Okay, good. As a scientist, I am dumbfounded that a scientific issue would have any kind of projection on the political axis, right? And it took me a long time to figure out why is it that you can stare at facts that seem to me perfectly clear and not interpret them the same way, depending on your political persuasion. And there are a number of reasons for that. We can get into the way the merchants of doubt have really distorted the public's view of the scientific consensus on that. But I also see a danger in some political champions going it alone, like Al Gore did in some way, and climate being identified as a left or as a blue issue. And that is my one concern with the Green New Deal, is that this comes to be branded with the Tea Party of the left, whereas it's really important to emphasize that they are politically feasible solutions right now that are neither left nor right. In fact, they appeal much more to market principles, and so theoretically they should be much more appealing to the right than to traditional government-oriented people.
Lisa, what's your take on the Green New Deal?
Well, I mean, I think I said I do think that it has created. Is mine off now? Man, sorry.
We're saving energy here with the mics.
I mean, yeah, I think there's no doubt that it has generated conversation and debate on climate change like few other things have in Washington. If in terms of I do think it's become a sort of it's become a benchmark for all the Democratic candidates. Every candidate has been asked where they stand on the Green New Deal, which has become shorthand for where do you stand on climate change. And I think if there's from a communicating climate change perspective, I'd say the one thing that is a caution is it's a very easy thing for, say, someone who is moderating a debate or asking a question on it. You can go more in depth in a newspaper interview, and everyone always complains that television media kind of gets climate change wrong or dumbs it down. And I think there's a danger that the question of do you agree or disagree with the Green New Deal is going to substitute for substantive questions that really need to be asked during the debate about where candidates not only stand on the science. All the Democratic candidates are very happy to draw a distinction between their belief in science and President Trump's belief that climate change is a hoax. But really, what are you going to do about it? Do you believe in setting a price on carbon? Do you believe in having a renewable energy standard? Do you support nuclear energy, or not? All those controversial things that candidates don't really want to talk about now are sort of being distilled into the Green New Deal. I suppose that's my sort of initial take now as I look at 2020.
Don't give up that microphone. We may need it again. Henry, I want to ask you a specific question about one of Helena's projects, but before that, how do you assess the current dialogue on this?
On the Green New Deal?
The Green New Deal, yeah.
The best analog I've heard about this is that we're kind of in purgatory, and we need to repent for our sins, i.e. we need to scrub the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, we need to deacidify the ocean, and we also need to act better in the future, i.e. we need to prevent the excess emissions of CO2 and methane. We need to do both. And I think that is missing from the current dialogue, that kind of very binary delineation. As it pertains to the Green New Deal, I saw it as a philosophy. And if you go to the etymology of Green New Deal, think about the first New Deal. The first New Deal represented an American age, which I was not yet a fetus for, but that required a transformation of our society on a scale that was unprecedented at the time. And I think the statement of the Green New Deal, irrespective of any of its contents, is simply that we need an effort at that scale to combat this problem that we're facing, which is unlike anything ever before. And I second past points on this panel about how there has been a politicization of the Green New Deal as a product of the radical left. That I think has been a negative component of it. But as a reactionary force, it becoming the topic of discussion in DC has forced a discussion on the fact that we have to have an enormous response to this problem on so many different fronts. And I think that that is hopefully going to be the legacy of the piece of legislation, far beyond any of its contents.
Yeah, I have to say, by the way, the interesting thing about the title, Green New Deal, is I was a fetus at the end of the Roosevelt administration. I have to say that Roosevelt, when he started out and talked about a New Deal, did not have any idea of all its specific content. Mm-hmm. He sort of made it up as he went along to try to deal with a problem that he thought was very real. So in some ways, the vagueness of the 8-page Green New Deal probably makes some sense and may have been designed, I think, to provoke discussion. Kevin, what's your take?
Well, you know, I'm not as bearish as some folks are on the Green New Deal. I'll give her credit, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The reason why is she has forced debate in Washington, D.C. So now, whether it's viewed as a benchmark, a threshold for Democrats, I think the vilification of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal has come by way of the Republican machine, if you will, subjectively. They do that well. Whether you were for the ACA or not, Obamacare, remember the death panels. You know, whether you're for single payer, Medicare for all, or the ACA. When you message and you pound that message consistently, you change or you create or you develop a narrative. And it has an impact on the minds of the American body politic. Is the Green New Deal absolutely perfect? No, by no stretch of the imagination. But the fact that she's forced this debate to happen in Washington, D.C. is a good thing, I think. But again, I want to go back, because I want to sort of decentralize, if you will, because I think what we have a penchant for sort of putting all our chips on the table and betting everything we have on Washington, D.C. as if that's going to be the panacea to all the political and social ills that impact the nation as well as the world. Quite frankly, no one in the world is watching Washington, D.C. or looking towards Washington, D.C. for any type of leadership. They're looking towards California for that leadership. They're looking towards California for that leadership on a whole variety of issues, whether it's climate change, the environment, immigration. And I would venture to say, even if we had a Democratic trifecta, a White House and a bicameral, you know, domination of the legislative branch, just like the Republicans just had until just recently, the way the structure is set up in Washington, D.C. is at a glacier pace. You know, things don't happen. This is a crisis that's before us right now that requires immediate action. I would venture to say, and I think that the only scientists on this panel here today would agree with me, that the issue of climate change is not scientific. It's not scientific at all. We have all the Nobel Prize winners. We have Mario Molina here with us today, a Nobel Prize winner. We have scientists, all the world's best scientists have given us the empirical evidence and the data points. They have done the work. This is a political issue. This is a leadership issue. And this is a lack of leadership that is before us. And you make a good point with regards to the free market. Free market's not really a free market. You put an asterisk with regards to the gargantuan subsidies. But when you undermine the idea of so-called free market principles and competition with regards to price point per kilowatt and what is the electron that you want to purchase to power your house, your home, your university, your car, your business, if you're Republican or Democrat, if you're a Donald Trump supporter, or if you're a free marketeer, George Herbert Walker Bush or Ronald Reagan, you want to pay less out of your pocket to pay for that energy, the energy that powers your home and house, and you want to have a job. So if you live in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, the home of Mitch McConnell, and all you know is coal mining, and your father was a coal miner, your father's father was a coal miner, and you have this sort of clean energy, renewable threat that's on the horizon, you may not understand CO2, greenhouse gases, criteria pollutants, etc. But you understand that the job that you have before you is tangible, it's real, it pays for the mortgage, the roof over your head, the food on the table, and the clothes on your children's back. But I think that's why the politicians have failed miserably their constituents, save for Bob Inglis himself, you know, who has been out there, you know, in the forefront from day one, that they should have seen this and positioned, you know, their constituencies, their communities for this type of change. And if you believe in creationism, and if the earth is still flat, then it is what it is, and I respect that. It is what it is. But if it is, your pockets are being lined by the fossil fuel industry, and you're fearful of Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell putting you in check and in line and not protecting you, then this is an issue of leadership, and it's a lack of courage of their convictions to do the right thing, regardless of if you're Black, white, Latino, African American, if you're a progressive leftist, or you're a right-wing ideologue, or you're in the center. This is a no-brainer because facts are facts and science are science. And that's why we're very lucky to be in California, because we believe in facts and science.
That's very interesting, and go ahead. And we're going to have a whole panel on the states and cities and what they can do. I do wonder at some point if we don't need, when you listen to John Kerry this morning, we don't need some kind of national action, some kind of national resolution on this. But I want to turn to Henry for a minute, because one of your big Helena projects supported the first commercial use of carbon capture technology. Can you describe that, and how do you see projects like that factoring into larger scale solutions to climate change?
Sure. The layman's way that got me into this particular field, because I have no training in this at all on a scientific level.
Has that ever stopped you from anything?
Thank you. Is that there's really no silver bullet to climate change. It's more like a silver buckshot. There's a bunch of different pellets. We have to do a lot of things simultaneously, and that's not my quote. It's an incredible quote from somebody else that I've stolen here for this panel. So one of those pellets is CCS, or carbon capture and storage, or hopefully carbon capture and then selling it as a product. So we were very lucky to, about 2.5 years ago, identify and start our first project on saying, can we identify the Steve Jobs of this field and support them as much as possible? And there's now many different companies in the space, but we supported a company called Climeworks that is able to sequester and suck and separate carbon dioxide out of the air and actually do a couple things with it. In one case, the pure carbon dioxide is actually pumped into a greenhouse, because if you have a greenhouse, you need a fake atmosphere. It's a small market, but it's a start. The second plant actually bound it to basaltic bedrock 100 meters underneath the Icelandic ground floor. And now this field is blossoming into hydrocarbon fuels and all these other uses. The big criticism of how is this economically feasible? And I think if you look at Secretary Kerry's speech today, there's been parallels to the prices of solar and wind being reduced over a long period of time. I can give you a specific analog in this field. So about 3 years ago, the American Physical Society put out a report saying that even at full scale, that they projected that at economies of scale, there would be no way or feasible way to reduce, to suck a metric ton of CO2 out of the air for under $600. And Climeworks' first plan actually beat that. It took subsidies, EU subsidies, but it actually beat that. And there are now projections, hopefully, to get it to around $100 or below. So again, this is just one example of a technology that I think we should be supporting on the state and federal level and international level. And indeed, there is a lot of support for, but it is in no way a substitute for the inaction on the political side. And we need both simultaneously.
Are there other things like this coming down the pike?
Yes, there are. I think there's a whole portfolio of them. And I go to your point and your point as well, which is that there needs to be national level movement on subsidies and in making this a more economically feasible market to get into. But I think the second we start seeing multi-billionaires in the carbon capture field, it's going to change the public dialogue. And the example I use, everybody and their mother uses, is Elon Musk, right? We worship these superheroes. Some of them are fictional. The Avengers is the top grossing movie, and it's about to be the top grossing movie again. And then there's these non-fictional superheroes. And I think our generation will be defined by change makers, entrepreneurial, non-fictional superheroes that address the climate this space. And once there's more of them, I think that will be one of the rallying cries that creates action on this issue.
Can I add something there? Because I'm 100% in agreement. I think it's a two-way street. I think that these change agents are absolutely needed, the entrepreneurs to create the technologies. Government is absolutely critical as well too, and they have to work together, because if it is not etched in stone legally, statutorily, the goals that we're trying to accomplish, that capital won't flow. So that entrepreneurial spirit is not gonna, come that easily. You have to have the benchmarks are set. We set some wildly ambitious goals without question. Do I know how to kind of get there yet? I'm not a technologist or a scientist, but we're dependent on exactly what you're saying, Henry, is the entrepreneurial skill set, the innovation and creativity to find and create those technologies to get us to if we're going to get to 70% renewable energy, I don't know if we get to 100% renewable energy, but what is the other 30% without picking a winner or loser, but allowing the technologists and the entrepreneurs with that skill set that they have and as a result, you create jobs. Mm-hmm. You create this economic ecosystem. You put everyday folks to work, and you grow an economy while we're reducing and eliminating, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere.
And could I add just one thing to add upon that, which I think is actually a concern about this, which is the difference between the problem of climate change on a PR and messaging level compared to past times in America's history in which we have galvanized huge entrepreneurial movements. So John Kerry talked about the Cold War. The Cold War there was a negative external stimuli, the Soviets. We were terrified, and we saw Sputnik, I wasn't there, but we saw Sputnik going up in the sky. Vietnam, right? So there have been times in which we can picture the enemy. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, but it's challenging to picture the enemy right now for the everyday American on climate change. There's a country in the South Pacific called Kiribati, and it will be the first country projected to partially or fully sink due to climate change. And I hope that we do not get to the point where we see a country sinking for the first time that society galvanizes around a negative external kind of visual stimuli. And we need to act before then and address the problem. And I've not seen, and I don't think many people have projected to see a way for the PR and the messaging element of this to be addressed.
I want to get to that in a minute, but Julien, I want to first ask you, you talked about your frustration that facts should be facts and science should be science, and Kevin referred to it too. Is there a way that you and your colleagues in the Academy can help make sure that research that reveals the facts actually shapes the political conversation?
Absolutely. In fact, I think it dovetails very nicely with the point Henry just made. For me, science is all about making the invisible visible. Before we invented spectroscopy, all we knew about the electromagnetic spectrum is what we can see right now, the visible. But now we know that there's a much bigger range, and this is what all our modern telecommunications are based on. And so similarly, I think making the threat of climate change visible, and I think Neil deGrasse Tyson said if CO2 was, a
meteor,
toxic shade of purple, we would already have solved the problem because we could see it. And you see that sort of correlated issue of air quality in places like China, for example, where the impetus to move away from coal isn't so much about the very distant threat, the distant and mostly invisible threat of climate change. It comes down to basics. People don't want to have black lung, right? And they're tired of coughing up their lungs every day and seeing their kids sick from it. So we do have more immediate incentives definitely to act on visible threats. And I think one of the roles of academia, in particular in a university like USC, is to find new ways to communicate these threats, perhaps through the arts, perhaps through innovative visualizations, to really drive home the message. Another way that I think is incredibly important is, I think, on the part of climate scientists themselves. We used to really be in the ivory tower mindset, and we thought it was enough to descend from the mountaintop every few years with an IPCC report that would summarize all the vast knowledge and assume that people would get the message. But clearly that strategy has failed miserably. I think it would have failed in the absence of very clever PR professionals upending this, and that's the merchants of doubt. But certainly, this was no match, right? So as climate scientists and as scientists of all stripes, we have to be able to get out there more often and offer a more positive message. And one of the ways that I see doing that is really looking at tying climate with history. I study the climate of the past few hundred years, past few thousand years, and you see many examples of past societies that have fallen at the hands of climate change. The only difference, actually there's several differences with what we have now. Now we have a more interconnected world. And even though we think of ourselves as more resilient to all kinds of threats because of our technology, in fact, we are more interconnected and more vulnerable in many ways. So think of disruptions to global supply chains and what happens when you have even one tropical storm hitting the South Atlantic coast and all the refineries on the Gulf Coast, and how that has ripple effects to the market. Now imagine magnifying that. Imagine the Syrian refugee crisis and the political havoc that has wreaked on some of the bedrock democracies at the heart of the European Union, like Germany, that have paid a dear political price for it. This was a byproduct of climate change, partially. There was a very complex socio-religious matrix underlying, the Syrian crisis. But what ignited the powder keg was a drought that could not have happened without climate change. So connecting the dots is really what the academy is all about. And once you start doing that, you start envisioning things in a new way. And I'll leave you with one more thing. I think one of the big lessons for me is that climate change is just the most visible consequence, at least the wildfires, the droughts, the storms. Those are the visible consequences of the failure of pricing carbon. So climate change is a market failure. So that's what economists would call an externality. And hopefully Dr. Oliva this afternoon will talk on that. But that's the reason why we need a price on carbon, right? Is because as it is, when we choose between buying a kilowatt of electricity from a coal power plant or from a solar array, we're not adequately pricing the cost of climate change to our society. And these costs are measured in very real terms, in terms of lives, in terms of property destroyed, and also in the lives of people who are still unborn. So that's some of the many things that the academy can do to connect the dots and offer a more holistic view of the problem.
So I want to build on that and on what Henry just said, and ask first Lisa, then Bob, then anyone else who wants to come into this. Bob, you've been out evangelizing on this for years. Lisa, you've been writing on it. What climate change narratives seem to have the most resonance with voters, seem to be most persuasive?
With voters, I'm not sure what has the most resonance with voters. I can tell you what we're trying to do and what I think resonates with a lot of our readers. So just to backtrack, the New York Times about 2 years ago or so started a climate team, and it's incredibly unique. I am part of a now almost 15-person team covering climate change at the New York Times. It is truly an incredible investment and acknowledgement that this is a subject area that readers care about, that the Times leadership cares about, and wants covered well. And I should say that the Washington Post is adding to their already excellent climate team, and I think hopefully on the media side, as difficult as things are in newspapers right now, there is somewhat of a race to the top on this, at least at national papers, on this issue. One of the things that we try to do, my editor, Hannah Fairfield, came to the climate team from a background in graphics. She was the graphics editor. And so she and we are always thinking about what are some ways that we can tell these stories in different ways, visual ways often, to be more resonant with readers. And so, for example, it could be something like videos in a story that explain the impact of climate change on a larger national or international story. Often it's really unique visual stories that we kind of bring to the Times. I'll give you one example that's my personal favorite. My colleague Nadia Popovich worked on for ages this wonderful piece. I don't know how many people saw it. Here, it's I think the headline is something like "How hot was it the year you were born?" And if you Google this and you look for it at the Times, you can look up the place that you were born and the year, and it will tell you how many extremely hot days, how many days over 99 degrees and hotter on average occurred in that city of your birth, the year you were born, how many days today, 99 degrees and higher, and how many are expected towards the end of the century. It's riveting. It's a way of understanding this story that probably no study story that I could write could do the same kind of justice to. We know that people care about climate change more. We're seeing the polling. I think the question will be, climate change as an issue for voters has always polled something around 15th, right? And we're seeing it spoken about enormously more than ever before in the primaries. We know that it's a very high issue for Democratic primary voters. Some polling has borne that out. I think it just remains to be seen whether it remains a strong issue for voters going forward in the general election.
Bob, what resonates most as you go around and talk about this?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think it's important to know that there are two different languages that are spoken on climate change. If you're a progressive, you generally speak in terms of doing with less and sort of a morality argument that fits with the left. It's not the morality argument of the right. Different language. And so on the right, the language is much more like the language that Henry is using, which is innovation and creating new energy, new opportunities, more freedom. That is a very different language. And so if you're talking walking and eating bugs, that's just doesn't work on the right. If you're gonna talk in terms of energy abundance and these entrepreneurs that are going to create this new stuff. And if you think about that, what it is our colleague Ed Maybach at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University is part of the Global Warming 6 Americas. And across all those 6 Americas, from Alarmed Alice to Dismissive Dan, if you increase the sense of efficacy, people can engage. And so the right will engage when they sense that there is an opportunity here, not just a danger. And so if you just talk about the danger, people shut down because, if you're going to tell me, the apocalypse is upon me, well, let's eat, drink, and be merry, right? Because there's nothing I can do. But if you tell me there is something I can do, I got a chance, and hey, free enterprise can solve this, then you get a very different conversation going. Last night, Win Lee, one of my team members, and I had an opportunity to speak to the Young Americans for Liberty and the college Republicans here at USC. And as you can imagine, I was talking about Milton Friedman. And it's a very different conversation probably than what would have gone on if, say, Al Gore had been here speaking to progressive students. But the interesting thing is that Al Gore would agree with what Secretary Kerry just said and what we say at republicen.org, which is simply price carbon dioxide, cause the recognition of the negative externality, and we can get this thing going. But you got to start with a different language. And so the language, what I was explaining to them last night is this great clip of Milton Friedman. You'll see on our website at republicen.org that Milton Friedman's on the Phil Donahue show. Some of you are too young to remember who Phil Donahue was, but he's basically a white guy doing an Oprah show, okay? And so from Chicago, and so he, Phil was a liberal. Dr. Friedman, of course, Reagan's economics advisor, the Chicago School of Economics. They used to spar, and so what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? And Friedman says, well, you tax it, of course. You tax pollution. And so what we try to do is help conservatives, actual conservatives, not populist nationalists, but actual conservatives to rehear the words of Dr. Friedman. You tax pollution. You internalize those negative externalities. You fix the economics problem, and then the environment takes care of itself. And the great thing is an incredible opportunity here because progressives, many of them agree with that. You just heard it from Secretary Kerry. If Al Gore were here, he'd say that's exactly what to do about climate change. And so I didn't go out of my way last night to tell the crowd at the Young Americans for Liberty and College Republicans that what we're for at republicen.org is exactly what Al Gore's been for about 30 years. But it's true, and someday we'll bring this together and lead the world to a solution.
Okay, we're going to turn over to Q&A in a minute, but I want to ask Henry one question that I think we're on a college campus. Why is it suddenly that young people seem to care so much about this? I mean, as I said in the brief conversation with Secretary Kerry, in 2000, 2004, 2008, all the way through 2016, this wasn't a big issue. And as has been suggested here, it's now becoming a big issue. I think it's being driven by young people.
Yeah, I hesitate to speak on behalf of all young people because I can't step in the shoes. It's such a diverse population. Half the world is under the age of 30 years old. I think that there's some messaging and cultural differences that I noticed just by having parents If you ask, you ask my dad or my mom, when they were my age, what is the most noble thing to do? They would say, I want to be the president of the United States, or it's getting into office. And I think if you ask my generation, it is often the private sector, or even the nonprofit or NGO world, which I think has its own major problems. And I think that shows a shift of intention between the accumulation of wealth as an end, as opposed to the accumulation of and the dissemination of impact into the world in a positive way as an end. And that's certainly something that drives me and that I feel. Just to supplement on the messaging front, there's two other things that I heard that blew my mind actually from Republicans recently on this. The first, we're lucky enough to work with General McChrystal as well as Norty Schwartz, the head of the Army, head of the Air Force through Helena. They consider, and you can ask them this, and they've said this publicly, the National Security Council said this, the single greatest national security threat we have during the next 50 years is climate change. If you talk about Republican messaging, I don't know if that would fly with voters, but that's an interesting thing to talk about. Why? Well, what's another issue that rightfully so the right thinks deeply about is immigration. We're about to have one of the biggest displacements of life in human history. And the other thing, the second, is historical parallels to climate change. It goes back all the way to, there's a great book about why Roman civilization fell, and you probably have scholarship on this, and I don't, but that this was a major. This is not something we've never dealt with before as a society. So to bring it back to my generation, I think that there is a we might call it wokeness, but there's this kind of different culture that pervades our generation about securing and prioritizing impact onto society over just capital that I think. By the way, is only in part possible due to the massive economic growth of the 20th century that existed, right? The world had half the population it did during the middle of the 20th century. So it's a different condition that we are building upon. I think that influences my generation significantly.
So I want to turn this over to some Q&A for a few minutes. Somebody will be out there with a microphone.
I want to say thank you for all of your efforts and just everything that you're all individually doing. I'm a USC alumni. I'm an environmental engineer, chemist, and I also am a sustainability manager. I work with agencies, transportation agency on sustainability. So for me, the biggest thing that I've always have, and also I've been on PBS, KFI, this topic is important to me, so that's why I'm here. And the biggest thing that I've always felt was the same thing that you're struggling as a scientist, like, how can they not understand? And I think the biggest effort, and I think the biggest ticket right now, because obviously the entrepreneurs, the politicians, everybody's doing their efforts, but I believe it's the communication and the social media that is gonna be I believe is the biggest way for us to communicate to everybody that it's everybody's responsibility. And just for example, as a sustainability manager, I'm seeing water bottles. It's that minute. I need to understand that everybody get that it's the minute things that we all must do that we will make the change. So the question is, your responsibility as a person for New York Times, like what is it that you think, how can you communicate to the bigger scale that every single person has the responsibility? And what kind of things are you guys creating so that everybody knows that they can be informed and how this can be communicated? Because there's just so many great ways that we can communicate through social media. But I really think the biggest ticket is you, the newspapers, the influencers, the people with the 20,000 followers. It really is those people to influence everybody, so then there could be more creators, influencers in the entrepreneurial side, and also people being inspired to be scientists, to be inspired to be politicians, for this to be that new deal that really is successful. So I'm just wondering, what is it you guys are creating at New York Times to create that communication to be a bigger impact?
Sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's two sides of the communication coin. There's how we in the media are communicating climate change, and then there's how sort of you in academia or in the nonprofit world or business world are communicating climate change, whether it's sort of through us in the media or through your own channels. The Times, as I said, for our part, I mean, I think we're putting in an enormous investment in telling this story in huge ways, whether it is on every, when when there is a major storm or extreme weather event, you know, we have our editors on the climate team discussing with the national editors, you know, how do we explain whether or how climate change is having an influence here? Should it be, you know, a separate story? Should we do, you know, something within this piece? We're always having these conversations about how to tell that better. You know, I do feel sort of obligated to point out, you know, there is a division of responsibilities here. I can be an advocate for openness and transparency and understanding science, but I'm not a climate activist. I'm not an advocate. I also have to have a responsibility to understand and relay to readers, you know, like yourselves, what folks who either don't believe that climate change is happening say and think, or more importantly, what people who have very different ideas about what to do about it say and think. I mean, you know, and just as another sort of parenthetical, I mean, with you know, we are always also thinking about what is the responsible way to handle climate denialism, you know, and at this point, you know, I mean, you have folks who for many years had been sort of on the fringe, and folks that we would not quote in regular stories, but now, you know, sort of the fringe is the establishment in Washington. And so when the President of the United States is saying that climate change isn't real, or windmills cause cancer. You know, you have to take that on and address that all the time. But I digress. You know, I mean, I think it's important for me as a reporter to be able to speak as much to, you know, scientists like yourself about the root cause of the problem and what some of the solutions are to climate change, as it is for me to be able to speak with, you know, the folks from the oil industry who have a lot of concerns about where their industry will be in a few decades, or the coal industry. When it comes to groups like scientists or NGOs or others communicating, I'm going to tell a very quick story. So a few years ago, I moderated a panel at the French embassy, and my mom was in town, and I invited her because it was fancy. And and she had a question, yeah, which I didn't call on her because I'm the worst daughter in the world. And to be fair, there was like a 50% chance she would have asked me how come I hadn't brushed my hair or something before I got in the panel. But my mom's question, which is relevant, which is the question my mom wanted to ask, and which we talked about later, was, you know, my mom wanted to say, look, I live in Wayne, New Jersey. I can't schlep to, you know, Washington D.C. for you know, panel discussions like this, or even New York, you know. But I come from a town where folks are educated and we care about these things, but we're busy. And, you know, why aren't there discussions like this? Why aren't there discussions like this at my local library? And so I think about that a lot when we talk about communicating climate change and driving people to action. Is some of the, you know, where are we having these conversations? And it's hugely important to have this conversation here, but I also think that it's really important to take these conversations to smaller and local levels even, and you know, have them in 4-H clubs and libraries and places where folks can get to and engage at a more local level.
I want to add something to what Lisa said, because it was really key. I'm going to venture to say, if you're a subscriber to the New York Times, I do believe you probably believe in facts and science, you know, and climate. So the question becomes, like, for Bob's constituents, for example, and those media outlets, it's not the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic Magazine, the Washington Post, LA Times. So we have to go beyond our comfort levels to, but you said something that was so key, I believe, Lisa, which is, this forum here today, or which is an excellent forum, or any other academic, you know, institution, the Aspen Institute, whether it's at the French embassy, right? But what your mother said with regards to how come we're not having these discussions, these town halls at the public libraries or the community centers, or in communities where folks are disproportionately impacted by the devastating consequences of carbon dioxide emissions, as well as other criteria pollutants, smog. smog, what our children breathe into our lungs every single day. So that's why we run the risk. And I think we have been somewhat successful in California, sort of kind of demystifying the issue of climate change and environment as only being the privilege of the elite in California. That's why it's absolutely critical that you actually democratize the benefits of climate change and making sure that everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic strata, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your legal status, has access to the latest, the greatest, and greenest, and most innovative technologies. Because it's not enough if you live, for example, in Chevy Chase, Maryland, or in Northwest Washington, D.C., or in Pasadena or Santa Monica or Palo Alto, if you have energy storage, distributed rooftop generation, you have a Tesla, a charging station, and a very energy efficient home. Well, great for you. So it becomes boutique-ish. But if we're going to actually meet our very ambitious global macro target goals, how we convey this and communicate this to folks who are not part of this discussion, but are actually most impacted by this discussion, is absolutely critical. And if it's not done with intentionality and a sense of purpose by leaders and politicians, we will have failed miserably by doing this. So we have to get to folks in the red states and other media outlets to really compound this message. People of color, Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans. Again, in California, we have 8 of the 10 most polluted cities in all of America in California today, even with our most progressive policies here today. So how we democratize this, and what your mom said was absolutely accurate as it comes. Instead of at the elite institutions, your mom's right.
Lisa, I think your mom's question may become one of the actionable recommendations out of this whole conference. We have time for another question.
Sorry, I speak for my community in saying that the vast majority of us, if not all of us, would be more than happy to be invited to a local library or something like that. So feel free to reach out if you want.
Yeah. A couple more questions, and then we have to just someone with a microphone get to someone with their hand up. Yeah. Okay.
I got a really interesting hit to feedback something that you guys were saying. It's a slogan: tax pollution, reward solutions. And if we reward solutions and even maybe go as far as helping the oil industry to transition and become heroes, it's just a thought that came to me just now. And solutions being rewarded would be a good positive.
Thanks. It's good. Smart idea. Another question? Someone with a mic? Here he comes.
So, talking about climate change, and it's all over the news, which is really great, but it makes me very anxious and very scared, and not just for my children and grandchildren, but for everybody in the whole world. So I'm always looking for something that I can do to forget this and to make things better. And I've heard a lot of dancing in a very positive way from the speakers so far on carbon pricing. And I'm wondering, what can we do to make that happen and to make it more than just a dream solution, but a real one?
Lobby your congressman.
Yeah, I think it is an answer that will work on both the left and the right, eventually on the right. Not yet, just make sure you understand it's still a little bit distance away on the right, because, for a while it was, I'm not a scientist, and then it was, well, it's happening, we don't know how much is human cause, that didn't last long. Now we're into innovation, not regulation. The next and obvious step is, how do you get innovation? Well, you fix the economics. And that will get eventually to carbon pricing. So just know that we got some work to do on the right to get it there. And so the answer is to be visible, particularly if you happen to be center right and you care about climate change. You're really the most important people in the world at this point, because like the line from Oklahoma, they're going about as far as they can go. I'm afraid the left is going about as far as it can go on climate. It's up to the addition of the right in order to make this happen. And so just reach out in patience to people on the right. If you're not of the right, reach out to somebody who's coming for Easter or Passover, that's Uncle Charlie, reach to him and try to get him on board, because that's when the member of Congress will respond, is when they start seeing a visible constituency. And so just be continually vigilant to reach out to especially conservatives.
Can I make one
Yes.
quick, just very quickly on this? And this might be a depressingly controversial thing to throw in the mix, but I think we have to be very cognizant of there's an asymmetry in responsibility for climate change. And the question that you said, I think is true, which is that everybody should do their part on climate change, but the parts are different. Walmart did a project which actually I thought was great called actually forgot the name of the project. They changed their supply chain. And actually, they were able to make more money through this change. And the displacement of carbon dioxide out of the air from this was equal or actually greater than the entire displacement of carbon dioxide from the country of Germany that year. Cement is 7% of all CO2 emissions, right? Refrigeration is this massive industry that is causing so much of it. Cow farts, these are these giant industries, and there's very small numbers of people that actually control elements. Cow belches, I apologize.
But
It's 50-50.
Yes.
Cow farts is what the Republicans framed it, right?
Yes, yeah, they brainwashed me, they got it.
The methane.
And I'm not trying to dance around the answer to your question, which is, yes, lobby your congressperson, but also try to ascertain, and hopefully people like myself can try to bring this information to be more mainstream, ascertain who's on the board of directors of the large corporation that might need to make a change. Saudi Aramco just had the largest profit, I think, in one of the last 10 years of businesses globally. There are ways to profitably change supply chain in the way that large Fortune 500s internationally work that can have massive differences on climate change. And that is something to lobby for or to fight for as an individual, is to also look at the private sector. And you need to do both, but I wanted to throw that in there.
I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead, Julien, fast if you can.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say another aspect of the communication about climate change is that it's always coming from the same talking heads, but actually the most effective talking heads are the people you care about. So you are the best person to convince the people in your family. We are not, because they care about you, and they will trust you more than they trust us. So I think this is not only a conversation for embassies and libraries, it's also a conversation for every dinner table. And you can be the best advocates of that to your surroundings, and that's how change happens.
Kevin wants 7 seconds.
The last thing, the last huge challenge to tackle is tailpipe emissions. And over at the Schwarzenegger Institute, that's what they're going to tackle, tailpipe emissions. We solve that. We will solve climate change, at least in the United States of America. We will do that.